What if everything your parents told you about security was a beautiful lie designed to make you easier to control? Picture this. It's 1931. There's a man standing in line at a soup kitchen in Cleveland. He's wearing a wool coat that cost him 2 weeks' salary 3 years ago. The coat still fits perfectly. The buttons are still attached. But there's a stain on the left sleeve that won't come out, and the pockets have holes worn through the lining from nervous hands checking for coins that aren't there. This man has a college degree. He speaks 3 languages. He can recite poetry and discuss philosophy and calculate logarithms without paper. And he hasn't eaten a full meal in 6 days. His name is William, and William is discovering something that makes his stomach hurt worse than the hunger. His education is worthless, not devalued, not temporarily unmarketable, worthless. Because knowing Latin doesn't fill your belly. Because reciting Wordsworth doesn't keep you warm. Because all those years spent learning sophisticated, impressive, completely abstract skills have left him unable to perform the one task that actually matters: feeding himself when the system stops feeding him. This is the moment. This is the crack in the facade. When William realizes that somewhere between childhood and adulthood, someone switched the definition of intelligence. They took the word that used to mean survival capability and turned it into a credential, a piece of paper, a symbol of cultural refinement that means absolutely nothing when you're cold and scared and hungry. And the truly horrifying part, the detail that William can't stop thinking about as he shuffles forward in the soup line, is that this wasn't an accident. The system didn't accidentally make him helpless. It was designed this way, not by conspiracy, not by evil men in smoke-filled rooms, but by the inexorable logic of industrial capitalism, which requires dependent workers to function, workers who can't leave, workers who can't survive without their paycheck, workers who have no choice but to accept whatever terms are offered because the alternative is starvation. William's grandfather wouldn't understand this situation. His grandfather lived in rural Pennsylvania, worked a small farm, raised 8 children on land that barely qualified as arable. And his grandfather was never, not for one single day of his life, in William's position, because his grandfather possessed something William doesn't have: the knowledge of how to continue existing when money stops flowing. His grandfather knew which mushrooms were edible and which would kill you in 6 hours. He knew how to set snares for rabbits. He knew how to preserve pork in salt. He knew how to tan leather and build furniture and identify medicinal plants and deliver a calf and repair a roof and dig a well. His grandfather was, by the standards of 1931, an ignorant man, no formal education, couldn't name the capital of France, had never read Shakespeare. But his grandfather could survive. And William, with his college degree and his 3 languages and his refined cultural knowledge, is standing in a charity line, hoping the soup hasn't run out. This is the trade that was made. This is the bargain that seemed so reasonable at the time. Your great-great-grandparents traded hard physical labor for easier mental labor. They traded the farm for the factory. They traded self-sufficiency for wages. They traded the ability to survive independently for the promise that they'd never have to. And for a while, for a glorious few decades, the promise held. The wages kept coming. The system kept functioning. Progress seemed real and inevitable and permanent. The cities grew. The factories hummed. The stores stayed stocked. Money flowed. Life got better, easier, more comfortable, more sophisticated. And with each passing year, the old skills faded a little more. Why learn to preserve food when you can buy canned goods? Why learn to sew when factory-made clothes are so cheap? Why learn to build when you can hire a carpenter? Why learn to do anything difficult when specialization is so much more efficient? Let me take you back further. Let's watch this trap being built. It's 1885. You're 17 years old. You live on a farm in Iowa. Your father grows corn and raises hogs. Your mother keeps chickens in a vegetable garden. Your family produces almost everything it consumes: food, clothes, tools, entertainment. You make your own candles. You make your own soap. You make your own music on instruments your grandfather built. You work hard, brutally hard. You wake before sunrise and collapse after sunset. Your hands are calloused. Your back hurts. You smell like animals and dirt. And then one day, a man comes through town. He's a recruiter for a factory in Chicago. He tells you about a different life. A life where you work 10 hours a day instead of 16. A life where you get paid in cash, real money, every single week. A life where Saturday nights mean going to shows and Sunday mornings mean sleeping late. A life where you wear clean clothes and live in a building with running water and don't have to slaughter your own food. You think about this. You think about it hard. Because the farm isn't romantic. The farm is exhausting and monotonous, and your father is getting old and mean from the constant strain. The recruiter is offering escape. He's offering modernity. He's offering a future that doesn't involve pig manure and pre-dawn milking and winters so cold the well freezes solid. So you go. You leave. You take the train to Chicago and you get a job in a factory that makes furniture. You operate a machine that cuts wood into precise shapes. That's all you do. 8 hours a day. Cut wood into precise shapes. It's mind-numbing, but it's easy. And at the end of the week, you get $11. $11. More money than your father sees in a month. You rent a room. You buy food from vendors. You go to the theater. You buy a suit that wasn't made by your mother. You feel sophisticated. You feel modern. You feel like you've won. 20 years pass. It's 1905. You're still in Chicago, still working in factories, though you've moved up a bit. You're a foreman now. You make $18 a week. You have a wife and 2 children. You live in a decent apartment. Your kids go to school instead of working. They're learning to read and write and do mathematics. They're going to have opportunities you never had. They're going to work in offices instead of factories. They're going to wear white collars instead of blue. They're going to be professionals. You're proud. You've built a better life. You've escaped the drudgery of the farm. You've given your children access to the 20th century. And then it's 1930. You're 62 years old. The factory closed 8 months ago. Your savings are gone. The bank that held your money failed. Your pension evaporated. Your wife is sick. Your children, those white-collar professionals you were so proud of, can't help you because they've lost their jobs too. The accountant's son, the secretary daughter. All that education, all those opportunities, all that sophistication. None of it matters because the system has stopped. The machine has broken, and you're sitting in a shanty town made of scrap metal and cardboard, and you're thinking about your father's farm in Iowa, the farm you couldn't wait to escape, the farm that seemed so primitive and backwards and exhausting, the farm where, even in the worst years, you never went hungry because the farm produced food. Because your father knew how to make the land give up what you needed to survive. And you don't know how to do that. You traded that knowledge for a paycheck. And now the paycheck is gone and the knowledge is gone and you're hungry in the richest country on earth. This is what I mean when I say the trap. This is the mechanism. The system doesn't trap you by force. It traps you by seduction. By offering you something genuinely better in the short term, more money, less physical suffering, more comfort, more status, more opportunity for your children, all of it real, all of it valuable, all of it contingent on the system continuing to function. And when you're young and the system is working, you don't think about contingencies. You don't think about what happens if the machine stops. Why would you? The machine has never stopped. The machine seems permanent. The machine seems like reality itself. But machines break. Always. Eventually. every single time. And when they break, the people who are most integrated into the machine suffer most. The specialists suffer. The educated suffer. The sophisticated urban professionals suffer because they've optimized themselves for a world that requires electricity and supply chains and functioning markets. They've spent years, decades, becoming very good at tasks that only matter inside the machine and outside the machine. In the cold reality of simple survival, their expertise means nothing. Let me tell you about a study that haunts me. It was done in 1933 by a sociologist named Mira Komarovsky. She interviewed 100 families in New York who'd lost their primary income during the Depression. She wanted to understand how unemployment affected family dynamics. What she found was unexpected. The families that suffered most weren't the poorest families. The families that suffered most were the professional families. The families where the father had been a manager or an accountant or a salesman. Because losing their job didn't just mean losing income, it meant losing identity. These men had built their entire self-concept around their profession. They were their job. And when the job disappeared, they disappeared. They became hollow. They became ghosts haunting their own apartments. Their wives reported that the men would sit and stare at walls for hours, that they'd become angry or sullen or utterly withdrawn, that they'd lost the ability to function. But there was a subset of families that did better. Not well. Nobody did well, but better. These were families where the father had working-class skills, carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. These men suffered economically just as much. They lost their jobs just like everyone else, but they didn't lose themselves because their identity wasn't tied to a specific employer or a specific position. Their identity was tied to capability, to the ability to fix things, build things, make things work. And even though there wasn't much paid work available, they could still exercise those skills. They could repair neighbors' broken furniture in exchange for food. They could fix plumbing for barter. They could maintain their own living space. They could do something. They remained functional. They remained human. The lesson here is uncomfortable. The lesson is that the hierarchy of skills we've constructed, the hierarchy that says abstract knowledge is superior to practical knowledge, is backwards. It's a luxury belief, a thing that seems true and valuable when the system is working but reveals itself as dangerous nonsense the moment the system hiccups. Because in the actual world, the world outside the machine, knowing how to fix a leaking pipe is more valuable than knowing how to analyze a balance sheet. Knowing how to grow tomatoes is more valuable than knowing art history. Knowing how to preserve food is more valuable than knowing corporate law. This doesn't mean art history and corporate law are worthless. Inside the machine, they're very valuable. But the machine is not reality. The machine is a temporary arrangement, a set of agreements and institutions that work until they don't. And pinning your survival to temporary arrangements is a form of madness we've been taught to call wisdom. So what happened? How do we build a civilization that makes people helpless? Let's trace the logic. It starts with something genuinely good: specialization. The recognition that if you spend all your time doing one thing, you get better at that thing than someone who splits their time across multiple tasks. This is true. This is valuable. A specialized carpenter builds better furniture than a generalist. A specialized surgeon performs better surgery than a general practitioner. Specialization creates excellence. It creates efficiency. It creates abundance. Because when everyone does what they're best at and then trades, everyone ends up with more and better stuff than they could produce alone. This works beautifully in a stable system. In a system where trade is always possible, where markets always function, where money always has value, where everyone continues to need the thing you specialize in. But stability is an assumption, not a guarantee. And the more specialized you become, the more dependent you are on that assumption holding. If you're a blacksmith in 1850 and the economy collapses, you're still valuable. People still need horseshoes and nails and tools. If you're a financial derivatives trader in 2008 and the economy collapses, you're worthless. Nobody needs derivatives when they're trying to figure out how to eat. The Industrial Revolution took specialization and weaponized it. It didn't just encourage people to specialize, it required them to specialize in tasks that only made sense inside industrial systems. Operating a specific machine, managing a specific type of paperwork, selling a specific product. These aren't skills, they're dependencies, they're positions inside a structure. And if the structure collapses, the positions evaporate. You can't take the skill of operating a 1920s textile machine and apply it to survival. It doesn't transfer. It doesn't generalize. It's not real knowledge. It's institutional knowledge. And institutions are temporary. But here's where it gets truly insidious. The system didn't just make people economically dependent. It made them psychologically dependent. It taught them that dependency was sophistication. That self-reliance was primitive. That needing the system was a sign of advancement. If you grew your own food, you were backwards. If you made your own clothes, you were poor. If you fixed your own tools, you lacked refinement. The modern person, the successful person, the admirable person, outsourced all of that. They focused on their career. They bought what they needed. They existed entirely inside the cash economy. And this was progress. This was civilization. This was evolution. And it was a trap. A trap built from good intentions and real benefits and genuine improvements in quality of life. But still a trap because it created a population that couldn't survive disruption, that had no fallback, that had traded every form of resilience for comfort and convenience and status. And when the disruption came, when the depression hit, millions of people discovered that they'd been living inside a beautiful machine that could stop at any moment. And when it stopped, they had nothing. Let me describe what nothing looks like. It's 1932, Philadelphia. There's a neighborhood called Kensington that used to be thriving. Textile mills everywhere. Thousands of workers making good wages. Rows of houses, shops, schools, churches. A functioning community built entirely around industrial employment. And then the mills close. All of them. Within 18 months. And Kensington becomes a ghost town. Not literally. The buildings are still there. The people are still there. But the animating force is gone. There's no money flowing. There's no work available. The shops are boarded up. The schools are struggling. The churches are overwhelmed with desperate people begging for help. And the people, the workers who'd been making decent livings just 2 years earlier, are scavenging. They're picking through trash. They're stealing coal that falls off delivery trucks. They're eating dandelions from vacant lots. They're burning furniture to stay warm because they can't afford fuel. They're desperate in a way that seems impossible in an industrial society. Because industrial societies aren't supposed to have starvation. Industrial societies have abundance. There's food. There's fuel. There's shelter. It exists. It's there. But it's locked behind a requirement. The requirement to have money. And when the money evaporates, when the jobs disappear, the abundance becomes inaccessible. You can see it. You can smell bread baking in the one bakery that's still operating, but you can't eat it because you can't pay for it, because you're trapped in a system that turns survival itself into a commodity. Now, compare this to rural America during the same period. Rural America suffered too. Don't misunderstand me. Farmers lost their land, crop prices collapsed, the Dust Bowl destroyed millions of acres. It was bad, but it was a different kind of bad. Rural people were poor. They weren't helpless. They were still producing food, less food, lower quality food, but food. They were still surviving on the land. They were still exercising the skills that had kept humans alive for thousands of years before industry existed. They were miserable, but they weren't bewildered. They knew what to do: plant, harvest, preserve, repair, endure. The crisis made sense to them. Droughts happen, prices fall, times get hard. You tighten your belt, and you work harder, and you survive. The urban industrial workers couldn't make sense of their situation because it was nonsensical. There was abundance everywhere. The farms were producing. The warehouses were full, and people were starving because an abstract system of money and credit had broken. It was surreal. It was Kafkaesque, and it revealed something that nobody wanted to see: that the entire industrial civilization was built on faith. Faith that the system would continue. Faith that the agreements would hold. Faith that tomorrow would look like yesterday. And when that faith broke, everything broke. So let's talk about what worked. Let's talk about the people who survived with dignity intact, who adapted instead of collapsing. There are common patterns in every story. First, they got out of the cities. Not everyone could. Not everyone had options. But the people who had any ability to leave urban areas did. They moved to places where land was cheap and survival was possible without cash. Rural areas, small towns, places where you could grow food, where you could hunt, where you could trade labor for goods, where the cash economy wasn't the only economy. Second, they rebuilt multi-generational knowledge. They found older people who still remembered how to do things: how to can vegetables, how to smoke meat, how to make soap, how to birth animals, how to heal minor illnesses with herbs. All the knowledge that had been dismissed as backwards and unnecessary, they learned it again, humbly, desperately, because their lives depended on it. Third, they embraced lower material standards of living. This is the hard one. This is where most people failed. Because going from an apartment with heating and electricity and running water to a tar paper shack with none of those things feels like death. It feels like failure. It feels like you're moving backwards through history. And you are. You are moving backwards, but backwards to a place where you can survive, where you have some control, where your continued existence doesn't depend on systems you can't influence. The people who couldn't accept this, who clung to the idea that they deserved their previous standard of living, who kept waiting for the system to restart and give them back their old lives, suffered longer and harder. The people who accepted reality, who said, yes, this is worse, but at least I can eat, survived. Fourth, they built new communities. Not the old communities based on employment and economic transactions. New communities based on mutual aid and shared skills and barter. Informal economies. Networks of people who helped each other because money wasn't flowing and formal systems had failed. These communities were fragile. They were imperfect. They were often unfair, but they worked. They kept people alive. They created structures outside the failed system that provided some basic level of security. And fifth, the ones who did best psychologically were the ones who'd never fully bought into the industrial promise, the ones who'd kept one foot in the old ways, who'd maintained gardens even when they didn't need to, who'd kept repair skills current even when it was cheaper to buy new, who'd preserved food as a hobby, who'd hunted or fished recreationally. These people had something to fall back on. Not just skills, psychology. They still had some identity outside their job. Some sense of self that wasn't tied to their position in the machine. When the machine broke, they bent. They didn't shatter. Here's what all of this tells us. The Depression wasn't primarily an economic crisis. It was a dependency crisis. a crisis of lost capability, of forgotten knowledge, of broken connection to the practical skills that enable survival. The economic collapse was the trigger, but the suffering was caused by helplessness, by the fact that millions of people had been taught to depend entirely on systems they didn't control. And when those systems failed, they had nowhere to go, nothing to fall back on, no plan B. And we're doing it again. Right now, we're building an even more sophisticated version of the same trap. We're more specialized than they were in 1929, more dependent on complex systems, more removed from practical knowledge, more confident that the machine will never stop. We've added new layers, digital infrastructure, global supply chains, just-in-time inventory, algorithmic management. We've made life easier and more convenient and more comfortable than ever before. And we've made ourselves more vulnerable than any generation in human history, because the distance between normal life and survival crisis is now about 72 hours. That's how long most cities have food for if deliveries stop. 3 days. Your great-grandparents had root cellars with months of food. You have a refrigerator with enough food for maybe a week if you ration carefully. This isn't sustainable. This isn't resilient. This is a civilization balanced on a knife edge, pretending the edge is solid ground. And the scary thing, the really terrifying thing, is that we know this, deep down, in moments of honesty. We know that complete dependency is complete vulnerability. We know that outsourcing our survival to systems we don't understand is dangerous. We know that specialization has gone too far, but we keep doing it anyway, because the alternative seems impossible. Because building real resilience requires sacrifice, requires effort, requires accepting lower levels of immediate comfort in exchange for long-term security. And we've been trained to optimize for comfort, for convenience, for ease, for right now. We've been trained to trade away tomorrow for a slightly nicer today, every single day, until tomorrow comes. And then we'll look at our hands, clean and useless, and wonder why they don't know what to do.